So we've got this really interesting data set on Danish trade with China. It's, well, it's definitely not boring.
Right.
We're going to unpack it, all the ups and downs, the trends. It's going to have a journey. Get ready for some surprises because this data, it tells a story.
It really does. I mean, you look at this relationship, Denmark and China, and it really highlights just how intricate global trade is, how everything's connected. It's fascinating.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. 2023. Big picture, what are we looking at? How intertwined are these economies?
Well, if you look at the total trade value, both imports and exports between them, it reached DKK 74.8 billion in 2023.
Okay, so that's...
That's significant, and it's made even more so when you look at the rankings. China was Denmark's seventh largest export market.
Wow, seventh.
Seventh.
Yeah.
And their eighth largest import market.
Okay, so those rankings, that tells me there's a real link there. But when I look closer at the export numbers, it's, well, is it just me or is it a bit up and down?
It's definitely a roller coaster.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
So 2023, you actually saw a dip. Danish exports to China went down 6% compared to the year before. But hold on, because the first 7 months of 2024, different story. Exports shot up.
Shot up. How much are we talking?
20.8% increase compared to the same period in 2023.
Whoa, that's a huge jump. But what's going on? What could cause those kinds of swings?
Well, it's rarely one thing, right? It's a whole bunch of factors. Global economics, for one, the whole world has its ups and downs. Supply chains, those are constantly shifting disruptions, can really mess with the flow. And then there's demand, what people in China actually want. That's always changing, too.
Yeah, so many moving parts. It's like trying to predict the weather, only it's the global economy we're talking about. But in all this, there's one area that seems to be doing incredibly well for Denmark. Medicinal products.
It's a real bright spot, and it makes sense when you think about it.
How so?
Well, in 2023, these products, we're talking medicines, pharmaceuticals, that sort of thing, they became Denmark's biggest export to China. A whopping DKK 16.17 billion worth.
That's incredible.
It speaks to Denmark's history of innovation in that area, their research, their development. It's top-notch.
So it's not just about having something to sell, it's about being the best at what you sell.
Exactly. You have to have the expertise, the quality that people are looking for, especially in a market as competitive as healthcare. That's where a country like Denmark can really stand out.
Okay, so we've looked at what Denmark is sending to China. But what about the other way around? What about investments flowing from China to Denmark?
Now that's where things get interesting because it's a very different picture.
How so?
Well, Danish direct investment into China, that sits at about DKK 42.5 billion. But Chinese investment coming into Denmark?
Yeah.
Significantly smaller, only about DKK 0.6 billion.
Oh, wow. Okay. So what explains that gap? Is it a
Yeah.
bad sign, something to be concerned about?
Well, not necessarily. We have to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Oh.
Investment decisions, they're complex. Think about market access, regulations, ease of doing business. All these factors come into play. And of course, each country has its own investment strategy, its own priorities.
So it's more about understanding those differences than saying one is good, one is bad.
Exactly. It's about nuance. China and Denmark, they have different economic landscapes, different approaches, and that's reflected in those investment figures. It doesn't necessarily spell trouble, but it definitely raises questions, things to explore further.
It's fascinating, isn't it, when we're looking at these numbers, but there's so much more to it. It's like trade exists in this bigger context, a global context.
Absolutely, and a big part of that context, geopolitics. You can't separate trade from what's happening on the world stage. It all ties in.
Right. And things have been, well, pretty interesting geopolitically these last few years. One thing you highlighted in your research was this idea of dual circulation in China. What is that exactly, and how does it affect a country like Denmark?
So it's a big deal, a real shift in thinking. Basically, China's looking to rely less on other countries and boost its own internal growth. Two parts to it. One, they want people in China to buy more, boost domestic consumption. Two, they want to be more self-sufficient, especially when it comes to technology, those key industries.
So it's not just about selling to the rest of the world anymore. It's about making sure things are strong at home, too.
Exactly. And for Danish businesses that have been working with China, it means adapting. They need to understand what China's prioritizing now, what sectors are getting that extra attention under dual circulation.
Can you give some specific examples? Like, where does Denmark fit into all this?
Sure, think about green technology. Denmark's a leader in that area. Sustainable solutions, that's kind of their thing. And guess what? China's pushing hard for green development too. So there's this natural overlap, this shared interest.
Right, so Danish expertise in things like wind energy, sustainable city planning, that becomes even more valuable to China now.
You got it. They've positioned themselves well, but it takes more than just having the know-how. Danish businesses, they have to be proactive, really understand the policies China's putting in place, and figure out how they align with that.
So it's not just about riding the wave, it's about, like, knowing which wave to ride and when.
And being ready to adapt when the waves change direction, because they will. And it's not just dual circulation either. Think about those regional trade deals popping up, things like RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Right, those agreements, they can change who has access to what, how tariffs work, even the competition within China shifts. Danish businesses can't ignore that.
They have to be savvy, figure out how to work within those new frameworks, maybe even find partners in those regions. It's about being agile, thinking strategically.
It's like this constantly evolving game of chess, isn't it? You've got to be thinking several moves ahead, anticipating what the other players might do. But even with all that, we can't forget about the human element.
You're absolutely right, because at the end of the day, it's people making the decisions, building relationships, navigating the ins and outs of doing business across cultures. That's what brings this whole thing to life.
So we've talked about the big picture, the strategies, but what does it actually look like on the ground for Danish businesses in China? What are they up against?
That's the key question, right? And one of the biggest things is the cultural difference when it comes to doing business. China, it's relationship focused, it's understanding the nuances, the unspoken rules, building that trust.
So it's more than just showing up with a good product and a contract ready to sign.
Way more. It's about putting in the time, being patient, really getting to know the people you're working with. And on a practical level, intellectual property, that's still a big concern. Companies need to be really careful, have the right legal protections in place.
So no cutting corners, do your research, make sure everything's solid from a legal standpoint.
Absolutely, don't underestimate that. And communication is key too. Being upfront with your partners, addressing any issues head on, that builds confidence. But it's not all uphill, right?
Right, because alongside these challenges come huge opportunities.
Huge. One area that's just exploding is e-commerce. The digital landscape in China is like nothing else. It's fast-paced, it's innovative, and it's a direct line to millions of consumers.
So for Danish businesses, it's about figuring out how to be a part of that.
Exactly. Alibaba, JD.com, these platforms are massive, and they're just the tip of the iceberg. You've got to understand how they work, how to reach people, how to market effectively in that space. It's its own world.
It's like you need a whole other strategy just for the digital space.
Pretty much. Because a website and a Facebook page, those aren't going to cut it in China. You've got to be where the Chinese consumers are, and that's increasingly online, on these specific platforms. But even bigger picture, I think there's a shift that needs to happen in how Danish businesses approach China.
What do you mean?
Well, for a long time, it's been about selling to China, right? Getting Danish products into that market, which makes sense, but what if it wasn't just one way?
Like a two-way street.
Exactly, because China, they're doing some really innovative things too, especially in areas like fintech, green energy, sustainable cities. There's a lot Denmark can learn from that, a lot of potential for collaboration, for sharing knowledge.
So it's almost like, what can we learn from each other? Partnership instead of just a customer-seller relationship.
That's it. It's about recognizing that both sides have something to offer. Imagine the possibilities if Danish companies went to China, not just to sell, but also with that mindset of learning, of being open to new ideas, new ways of doing things.
It's a different way of thinking about it, that's for sure.
It is. And it's not always easy, right? It takes effort, it takes being open-minded, but the potential payoff, that's huge. And not just for individual businesses, but for both countries.
Well, on that note, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about. We've covered a lot of ground today, the ups and downs of trade, the influence of geopolitics, the importance of cultural understanding, and that really interesting idea of seeing China not just as a market, but as a potential partner for innovation and growth. It's complex, it's constantly changing, but that's the world we live in, right? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions. Until next time.